would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. Welcome to it, folks. We're going to charge headlong into some interesting, a little bit esoteric, I guess. It's a little bit kind of big picture stuff. There's going to be quite a few graphs and images posted to Pinterest for this one that are just going to knock your socks off. But there a few interesting articles came out. One came out from Peak Prosperity that I thought was very interesting, that really is cutting to the core of what do you do. And we will chat more about that. Of course, if you'd like to get in contact with me, the best way to do that is through the website. Just head on over to therebelbroker.com. Click on the contact link in the menu bar and send along any ideas, suggestions, or observations that you might have. Happy to entertain them and respond. If you would like to check out the show notes for today's show, you can find those at the website as well. In fact, while you're at the site, there's a couple other things you can do. One, you can go to the show notes for any show and click the button titled Join the Rebel Underground. I have also changed the way the show notes get sent out within iTunes and just about every other venue. It used to be it would just be a word, and in most places it was supposed to be a link, but some places it stripped the link out. Now I've just included the URL for those things. So right now, no matter where you get access to the show notes for the show, whether it's via iTunes or Spreaker or iHeartRadio or however you get to it, you should be able to see the link that you can actually use to join the Rebel Underground. So go ahead and do that. It'll give you access to exclusive content that's only available to those folks. Later this year, that is going to start to get ramped up. I've kind of got a little bit of a plan put in place on how I'm going to provide more content for folks in the Rebel Underground. And then, of course, while you're at the site, also go to the tippy top of the page, big red button titled Take the Survey to Support the Show. You'd be doing me a huge favor. One of my big goals is to grow the show and really sort of get it on a paying basis so I can spend more time providing you with the content you want and need as it relates to real estate. If you do click that, you'll be asked for your email address 2 times. Use the same address both times you're asked. You'll be asked a handful of demographic questions. And that's it. You're all done, and you've helped support the show. And to show my thanks, you will immediately be entered into the drawing for a $50 Amazon gift card. Now, this drawing happens at the beginning of every month. We've given away $500, $550, $600. I don't know. I've kind of lost count at this point. But we do that at the end of the beginning of every month. And congratulations to all those folks that have won. Good luck to the folks who have not yet won, but soon will. All right. I don't know. I've got several articles that I'm interested in covering today, and one of them is really interesting. We'll cover an awful lot of what's covered in the article at Peak Prosperity. I'm going to, as I mentioned, include a link to it because I think this one really summarizes the bubble potential that we have going on with the market right now, which would absolutely be an impact. And it's also designed to sort of try to explore the question, what do you do with your money? What do you do with it? I have had so many people ask me, well, where do you put it? And I've had some people say, I've opted out. I've got cash that I'm just holding in my hand. And I'm not really sure that's the way to go. Some people seem to think some people who I respect, some people who seem to know what they're doing seem to think that's the solution. I'm not sure that it is. We'll talk a little bit about that. But we do have a few other items that we could bring up that I think are interesting in terms of, having some takeaway data that would absolutely be influential in how we move forward as investors, whether we're going to be buying and flipping or buying and renting. those types of things. Now, the first one comes from Realtor.org from their news section. The headline, Buyers Accept Extreme Commutes for Affordability. Now, this is something we've been talking about on this show for a while, and it relates to the mushroom effect, which is if folks need to get to some of these really expensive markets, rather than pay these higher prices for homes in those markets, like a mushroom kind of growing out from the top and spreading and shading other outlying communities, folks have simply moved away from those epicenters into areas where their prices are lower, and then said, you know what, I'll just suck it up and I will embrace a longer commute. Now, this was a dynamic we've been talking about on this show for, it's probably been almost 2 years now that we've been harping on this one and really pointing out that it's a great way to get ahead of a marketplace, get into a market where things are likely to grow. Because what's great about things like this is it tends to give you a lot more strength in terms of buy and flips because you're riding momentum. You've already got a certain amount of market momentum as more people go to those areas who, like at San Francisco as an example. Now, this applies anywhere where the same kind of circumstances are occurring. But in San Francisco, we saw a level of sanity kind of kick in where folks said, forget it. I'm not playing the game in San Francisco anymore. I'm going to go over to Oakland, or I'm going to go north, or I'm going to go whatever direction I can go to find cheaper housing, and I'm going to do that there. It would pay off amazingly for folks who are doing the buy and flip strategy, because even if you do nothing to the property, you're able to ride out a couple of months of appreciation. It's pretty reasonable. I mean, it's hard to argue with several percent of appreciation on a month-to-month basis in some areas. But it also represented a big boost for renters as demand in those areas, even for rentals, increased. So it allowed either one of those strategies to play in and work for you. Now, to sort of quantify this, the U.S. Census Bureau, which defines a long commute as 60 miles each way, reported in 2013 that 21% of commuters spent 60 minutes or longer traveling to work. New York State, at about 16%, had the highest rate of long commuters, followed by Maryland and New Jersey, both at about 15%. Let's see. We are now getting more middle and upper level executives with young families looking for prime waterfront property, according to Meg Waltz with Coldwell Banker in Madison, Connecticut. Buyers are purchasing 4 and 5 bedroom waterfront homes in Madison for about $2 million, which is half of what they would pay in Fairfield County, as an example from there. And while this is something they're talking about, focusing on a lot of East Coast examples, on the West Coast, we're seeing very similar things in terms of people being willing to go further south. Now, I happen to be in one of those communities that would be described as one where you'd be increasing your commute to save a little bit of money, but we're well now within the umbrella of being in Silicon Valley and Morgan Hill, and you have to go a little bit further for that really to be the case. But it's also happened south of here in places like Gilroy and San Martin, and as I've mentioned before, it's even happened in places like Hollister, which is ridiculously far out there. Now, Morgan Hill is only about 30 to 45 minutes away from most high-tech places in Silicon Valley. Hollister is another 40 minutes. So it's like an hour and 15 minutes from all those areas. And that absolutely qualifies. And as I mentioned last year, I had 2 transactions. I think I talked specifically about one of them last year, which blew me away. We had multiple offers. In order for my folks to get it, we had to offer quite a bit over asking price. And it was ridiculous, frankly. I am not a huge fan of Hollister, and just getting there from where I am. And remember, when you leave from here, you're 30 to 45 minutes away from your job in Silicon Valley. I don't like the drive from here to Hollister. It's a 1-lane road in each direction. It is very agricultural, so you get tons of big trucks. It's a pain in the butt. So there's an additional level of stress. It's not just a question of distance. It's a question of the quality of the commute that you have to deal with. So even my marketplace is seeing those kinds of outlying areas being very profitable. I know folks that are doing exceptionally well with investments in Hollister. However, I think they also carry with them a warning. These are not, if I were doing it, I would not be categorizing those as long-term investments. I would be keeping my fingers on the absolute pulse of the market. And as soon as anything hinky started to happen, I would be looking for an exit strategy. Hollister is an ultimate canary in the coal mine. in terms of markets that get just beaten up when things go wrong. If you look back to 2007, 2008, Hollister was beaten down like crazy. I actually had to try and sell a home for someone back when Hollister was still, the vast majority of homes in Hollister were foreclosed properties. And so from my client's house, you could stand in the front yard and point to 8 other homes that were listed. All of them were foreclosures and all of them cheaper than what my folks wanted to sell my property for. And to be honest, I consider that one of my greatest successes, getting those folks their asking price in such a depressed market. But anyway, I would not want to find myself in that position with another downturn coming up. So if you, and I'm not talking to you because you may or may not invest specifically in Hollister. What I'm trying to communicate is that if you have a community like this that fits in with your local market, whether we're talking about Atlanta or Memphis or New York or St. Louis, wherever, if you've got one of these communities that's way out there that has enjoyed a huge amount of growth or seeing a lot of growth, but it is way out there, this is something you need to be far more involved with. And if you're a brand new investor, you need to keep a sharp eye on what's going on so that you can be clear of what equals an exit strategy for you, and stay firm with that. You know, it's like the guy who goes to Vegas and says, you know what, as soon as I win X amount of dollars, I'm going to put the money I came in with in my pocket and I'm not going to spend it. And as soon as I have lost X% of what I've won, I quit, right? That's a strategy. That's, you know, it doesn't equate it exactly the same, but if certain statistical things occur in your marketplace or you identify things that should be scary and those things happen, don't second guess what you decided under the full light of sanity in terms of what your next step should be. Define on a piece of paper, this equals a scenario where I'm going to get out of this marketplace. Now, of course, something else completely nuts may happen. You may see, if you saw, for instance, if I'm anticipating a drop in the stock market in October, and I'm expecting that in 10 years, people will look back at the month of October in 2017 and say, that's when they first started it rolling. That's not when everything hit the bottom, but it is the moment when we finally had this reality check that things were declining, right? I think it'll be one of those defining moments. I think you and I have explored together a lot of different things that are scary. You know, we could point to, well, you know what? And we were talking about these scary things months ahead of that. But I think the first sort of broader understanding that something wicked this way comes will be this October. So if that is true, if you're hedging your bets, if you're thinking, you know what, Robert may be off, and that's absolutely possible. You know, I don't have a crystal ball. I try my best to look at the data and figure out where that leads me. But if you consider that to be a thing that you should worry about, maybe that's it for you. Maybe if you're invested in one of those types of communities, you want to pull the ripcord on your parachute right when that happens and try to sell it when you're still going to get your money back and more, probably, if you've been investing in an area like that for longer. And what would be great is you'd be in the catbird seat. You'd be in a situation where the market hasn't contracted enough so that rentals in your marketplace aren't as attractive as they used to be, right? One of the first things that'll happen when things start to contract and things go bad is that folks will look at their situation and decide if they have the resources to make things better for themselves, whether that's shortening their commute, getting better accommodation somewhere else for the same price, those types of things. If you can put that on the market as an investment property and say, hey, it's occupied, it's making X amount of dollars per month, it's got good cash flow, if you're selling it as an investment, great, more power to you, and that could be good. However, analyze your market to figure out which is the most in-demand part of the marketplace. By the time something like this happens, other investors may have gotten the same idea. So then you'd want to market it not so much as an investment property, but more as a property for someone to use as a residence. Whenever you introduce the emotional side to these types of things, typically you're going to get a little bit more return out of it than other options. Okay. So extreme commutes, we've talked about them before, and it definitely illustrates this willingness of folks to go outside of a normal commute envelope in order to get their stuff settled. Interesting thing, one thing we like to keep track of here on the show is, how do consumers feel about housing, right? Because oftentimes these can be indicators as to what actions they will take next. Consumers were asked by Bankrate, what is the best way to invest money you don't need in 10 years or more? And real estate was number one with 28%. Cash investments was number two with 23%. The stock market was next at 17%, then gold at 15%, bonds at 4%, other at 6%. I'd love to find out what was this pool of people? Were these internet people that go to bankrate.com? I'd love to find that out, because your average person, I'm just not sure a lot of folks know the difference between some of these things. So it would be interesting to find out the attitude of folks. But the idea that real estate came out in front is interesting. It's interesting because it also fits in nicely with the other data we've covered that talks about how confidence in the marketplace in terms of sellers feeling more confident about selling, buyers wanting to buy. And right now, we don't need to increase the number of buyers. We need to increase the number of properties available. That's the dynamic that needs to be addressed here. I think if we ever actually do meet the demand for buyers, we will be shocked by how, relatively speaking, there aren't as many buyers out there as people think. That's my personal opinion. A lot of folks like to argue with me about that one, but I actually think that would be the truth. I don't think we need to get up to the old construction levels that we were at before in terms of the peak just before the downturn in order to meet the demand. I think if we made it halfway, if we went from where we are now to halfway to and took the last peak and put it and found a point between the two, just right between the 2 points, I think that would satisfy current level demand. So I don't think it's as high a mountain to reach as some other folks seem to think before it would really start to impact what homes sell for. But clearly, the public in general looks at real estate positively in terms of places that they'd like to put their money. And finally, before we jump into the meatier topic for today, in a recent survey, we have the highest number of renters in 50 years right now. More Americans are choosing to rent than at any other point in the last 50 years, and that's according to the Pew Research Center. In 2016, 36.6% of households rented their homes, just shy of the 37% record in 1965, according to the data. The number of U.S. households has increased by 7.6 million over the past decade, but while the number of homeowner households has remained relatively flat over that period of time, the number of renter households has soared by 10%. There is some evidence that increased student debt has made it more difficult for households headed for young adults to become homeowners. And how about low inventory? Or how about trying to get into these markets and discovering that they are absolutely impacted shoulder to shoulder with buyers? Richard Fry, senior researcher at the Pew Research Center, told CNBC there's some evidence that increased student debt has made the problem. Fry also notes that young adults may be struggling to save enough for a down payment on a house. Adults aged 35 and younger continue to be the most likely of all age groups to rent, according to Pew's findings. 65% of households headed by young adults were renting in 2016. That is an 8 percentage point increase from 2006. So renting is becoming more popular, as renters may not be completely happy about their living situation. 41% of renters recently surveyed by real estate site Trulia say they wish they had bought instead of rented. Further, renters are optimistic that their living situation will change in the future. 72% of renters say they would like to buy a house at some point, according to the Pew survey. Now, why is this one so important to us as investors? This absolutely reflects the mindset. It tells us where we are. Forget we for a second, right? Because we aren't our customers. The folks out there who currently rent, the vast majority of them do not want to be renters. And I think that's an important thing to understand. So that communicates a few things to keep in mind as someone who has a buy and rent strategy. Number one, your person does not want to keep renting your house. Your person wants to find a house of their own to buy. And it's a huge chunk of them. And we have a record-setting number of folks who are currently renters. That means the pool of people who want to rent, pay money for what I have to offer as a landlord is at a peak, right? And the majority of those people don't want to be buying my product. So what do you do with that? As soon as we start to see, we need to be, as folks who own rentals, sensitive to the market shifts that will occur that facilitate these folks moving from being renters to buyers. So if we make it simple, right? I know I can get into the esoteric nitty gritty of different things that I think are nudging this economy one way or the other in terms of how they'll affect real estate and investment strategies. But the single greatest thing for you to pay attention to as a landlord who rents a home, particularly if you're dealing with tighter margins on your property, if you are only walking away with not a lot of money, if you're not getting the percentage return on investment that you'd like, if you're not getting 15% return on investment, you may want to have a strategy, as I mentioned with folks before that maybe are in those more high-risk areas. You need to come up with a strategy that identifies that specific occurrence that means it's time for you to sell or just back out of the property, move into something else, or come up with a different plan. And if it were me, that singular element would be houses coming online. So I would go out and I would get myself plugged into every builder's website and get emails when new construction is happening. Stay plugged into what's happening in your local marketplace. And I'm going to include single-family residential, condos, townhomes, all of that stuff in that. And when you start to see a large number of new homes getting approved for permits, I think that would be the moment for me, right? Because the time between the permit gets issued and the time the property comes up for sale is probably what? 6 months to a year, depending on the size of the development. I would look at it as a win. If you feel like the numbers threaten you, I would consider moving out of that and moving into a flip it strategy, or potentially approaching your renter and offering them a lease option and see how that goes. You could potentially get folks locked in for a little bit longer, and if they don't exercise the option, then you get to keep whatever funds they've put up. But it secures your position a little bit. So it would absolutely be something that I would keep an eye on and have a trigger that sets off your gears to reevaluating whether or not you want to hold on to this. Now, I know that as long as this show's been around, I've always suggested that whatever investments you have in real estate, every single year you should sit down and reevaluate the scenarios and see if it makes sense for you to continue with your investment as it currently sits. I think we're at a point where things are changing quite quick enough, or enough things are potentially changing, that you might want to up that. If you're really concerned, if you think things are just happening at too quick of a pace in a lot of different segments of the economy, maybe this is something you do every quarter. Maybe every quarter you sit down on a Sunday afternoon and spend a couple of hours analyzing your properties and figuring out, where am I? Is it steady sailing from here on because nothing's really changed? Or have I seen enough news items, or have I found out from the county seat that permits have been issued for this kind of construction, or whatever? Is it time for me to change my strategy? And the reason why I say that is I think once a year is no longer enough, because something could happen between in one single year. It would stink for you to suddenly be surprised by 4 sale signs and billboards popping up for a new development and seeing that potentially eat away at your pool of tenants, or even the person currently in your property. But here's the other side that you need to keep abreast of, and that is the trend in homes listed for sale. If for some reason a ton of homes come on the market for sale, you should be aware of that. Now, unfortunately, that's data that comes along too late for you often, right? If you suddenly see a huge jump in the number of homes that are listed for sale in your marketplace, it's the problem has already arrived, right? It's already at your doorstep. If your renters are already looking for a place to buy under these new circumstances, and you're seeing prices down from last year or flat from last year, you're feeling like the growth in sales has reached a peak, you need to evaluate how much strength you still think you have in your rental marketplace. So keep that all in mind as we keep going. Now, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about what peak prosperity is describing as the mother of all financial bubbles. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right. Aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate.
So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I came across an article on Peak Prosperity the other day. When day was this article written? July 22nd. I was reading this, I think it was Sunday night, and I was kind of letting it percolate in my head. The title is, what is the title? What to do with your cash? And the subheading here for at least one of the paragraphs is the mother of all financial bubbles. So I'm not going to just read this whole thing. We're going to hit some highlights. I am going to strongly suggest you read this because I think there is a lot of food for thought here. And it really comes down to strategies. After going over some of this information, I want to hit a couple of questions I've gotten from folks both through YouTube and from email relating to this topic. Because I have one listener on YouTube who's like, I'm out. You know, I'm keeping my cash, and I don't think that's a necessarily a bad call. It's one of the calls you could make. But the thing that annoys me about that option is, well, then you're at the mercy of inflation, right? If your money's just sitting there, if it's sitting in a bank account, it's not making any money, right? If it is making money, it's making 0.0 something percent. So you're losing money every single cycle, right? So that doesn't make sense to me. But let's talk about the options here and see what might make sense. So this article starts out making kind of an interesting point, asking a few questions. The first question to ask is, have you moved a material percentage of your financial portfolio to cash? Have you become so concerned about the meteoric ramp upwards in asset prices that you find it wiser instead to move to the sidelines, build, quote, dry powder, and wait to re-enter the markets at saner valuations? Some people have. Now, I have not. I've always felt like I am in the process of doing that to one degree or another right now, simply because I think that asset valuations are way too high. We're at a crazy point. There's a table that I'm posting to Pinterest that you can check out that's from this article. It's kind of shocking because it shows the historical effect of the downturn, right? On asset prices. And you realize, you know what? That was really historically not that big of a deal. And I think the potential is for us to get a much bigger hit now than then, particularly when you look at where these values have gone since then. It gets kind of nuts. Now, the author of this is someone who has bought into this strategy. And he states, the past 5+ years have been brutal for savers pursuing this strategy. I know this well, as I am one of those folks too. Now, I never suggested you do this 5 years ago. I think looking at the markets 5 years ago, it was easy to see that there was some propping up going on, and there was some stuff that isn't too great, but it wasn't a situation where things felt imminent, right? It didn't feel like we were about to see really bad things come about. It didn't feel like it was time to stop buying real estate in certain areas. It just wasn't there. Now, over the last year and a half, 2 years, for those of you who've been listening for a long time, you know the tenor of this show has changed from getting those great deals, where the most amazing deals are. And for those of you who go way back, you're remembering shows where we would randomly pick a listing off the MLS and do a return on investment analysis of buying it at list price, and we were positive cash flow. We would do it over and over in all these various areas. Well, you can't do that anymore. And that was 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago. Things started to go a little bit wonky just over the last 2 to 3 years. And as things have gone on and more things have heaped on in terms of just repeating some of the errors left, I'm not going to go down the long list of errors we're repeating. I'm going to suggest you go back and check past shows. We've listed out all the stuff that's happened relating to credit rating, tweaking credit ratings so people's credit ratings are better, lending habits and standards and policies that are now emulating, giving us the same bad results that we got last time with no income, no job loans and stated income loans. We're seeing all of that stuff happening again. Some even more egregious in terms of lending sins than last time. So go listen to some of those past shows to check those out. If I If I've got the bandwidth, I'll go ahead and put links to those in the show notes at the website at therebelbroker.com. Those links won't be in any other venue. You'll have to find those at the website just because it's easier for me to do it that way. Now, what's interesting here is this isn't an argument, right? Some of the things they're pointing out here are not arguments about these facts. Absolutely, these assets are priced at a very high level. The only question is it a reality-based level? And to some degree it is, simply because what the reality we live in is what's happening right now. But then you have to ask yourself, what's the reality of the numbers that are presented? How close to what is reality representative of things that are screwed around with by policies or by regulations? Or would you consider these more manipulated things? I think we have to lean more towards manipulated, at least on the lending side, in terms of who can borrow, the quality of them as borrowers is, how much money they should put down. These are all things that are being manipulated. Sane lending practices are not part of the equation anymore, just like they weren't last time between, say, 2002 and 2006. We're seeing the same kind of goofy thing where we're thinking just lending the money is a good thing, as opposed to anyone who's qualified, anyone who meets some standards should be able to borrow, but the standards just keep getting screwed with. So that's how we're manipulating on the buyer side. And that's the worst part of it, because it simply creates more buyers who then artificially boost up prices. The more buyers you have out there, the higher the prices will be, because there's more people bidding on each property. If we were to go back to just the sane lending standards, we've had far fewer buyers, but we'd have saner sales numbers. We would have, and this is particularly true over the last 2 years when we've seen such ridiculous appreciation, because it's over the last 2 years, and it's gotten worse, right? If we were to go back in time 2 years, as we move through time back to today, the insane lending practices get worse and worse and worse and worse. So it's not like somebody enacted bad lending policies again 2 years ago and we're just reaping the rewards of those or the punishments of those. This has been a steady rolling move to make lending more and more nuts. At peak prosperity, according to this, they've chronicled the global central banking cartel started flooding the world with liquidity. And that reeks of conspiracy theory stuff. Whenever I hear a sentence like that, I want to put on my tinfoil hat. But if you want to talk about just central banks and eliminate the words that kind of imply some great conspiracy, it's absolutely true. They have flooded the world with liquidity. They have printed crap tons of money. We've talked about that before. We've also talked on previous shows about the velocity of money, and higher velocity money gives you higher inflation because that's money that gets printed that goes directly into the hands of people who will spend it. Lower velocity money is money that gets printed but only gets given to banks. And that happens when you buy a house, right? You never get that money in your pocket. If you sell your house and buy a new house, you never see that money. You never stack up piles of $100,000 in front of you. I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to roll around in it naked. But that's probably a vision you don't want to keep in your head too long. It even makes me a little bit sick thinking about it. Because I'm going to sell my house and I'm not going to buy another one. At least I'm not going to buy another one I'm going to live in. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that fits in with where's the logical place to go from this data. But in any event, most people don't do that. Most people sell their house and buy another one. So you never see the money, right? It's all wire transfers. It's escrows. It's you sign this piece of paper to show the escrow is closing on you selling this house. You sign another piece of paper on it buying this house, and that money just magically gets digitally wished around from one escrow to another escrow. And if you simplify all of that, if you take all the paperwork, all the signatures, all the escrow people, all the real estate agents, all the humans out of the equation, it's really just one bank handing a pile of money to another bank. It might even be a bank handing money to itself. Right? If you're dealing with Chase Bank to hold your note, and you're getting your loan for the next house from Chase, well, the only bank involved is Chase. So it's literally Chase moving money from one account to another account. That doesn't have any velocity, right? It doesn't end up in your pocket for you to buy bread and milk and cars and chairs and TVs and all that other stuff. It ends up still staying with the banking industry. So it has lower velocity. So it tends to result in a lower amount of inflation. And if you want to talk about what is going to kill us on inflation, Check out past shows I've done on what's going on with pensions. I think I did a show Friday last week or Thursday last week that covered some of that, so you might want to check that one out. They go on to state that all that liquidity has to go somewhere, and as hoped, the central banking cartel, it has found its way into the financial markets, pushing the price of nearly every asset class to record extremes. And we talked about this. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where no one believes that the stock market, for instance, is undervalued. Everyone believes that the stock market is overvalued. And if we just apply the word correction to the stock market, nobody believes those corrections go up. Everyone believes those corrections go down. The question is by how much? I think a reasonable number is 20 to 25%, spread out over a quarter, maybe. And I think that the beginnings of that will be this October. We'll see. I may be wrong, but I'll tell you this much. If I'm wrong, it's going to be just on timing. It's not going to be about what happens. We will see a reimagining of what the value of the stock market is. And I think that could have a very dramatic effect on all these other things we've talked about, whether we want to talk about pensions and then the effect of that on inflation and all this other stuff. Now, the article goes on to talk a little bit more about bonds and equities and some other things which are interesting, not really appropriate for us to get deep into here, but it does help us when we get down to discussing home prices. Now, home prices are back to the same level they were before the last bubble. We're now above it in most, right? They go on to state, we've written numerous articles about the dangers of the current central banking policies responsible for today's nosebleed asset prices. But the gist is this: we are currently living within the mother of all financial bubbles. These prices are in no way sustainable. Why not? While the reasons are legion, and they have spilled plenty of ink writing about them all, the big reason is revealed in this chart. Now, this is the chart. This is the chart that I'm sharing on Pinterest. I think it is huge. If you take a look at the all sectors, debt, securities, loans, liabilities. Now, remember, one thing that's been the mantra of this show now since the new year, and since a little bit before the new year, is it's the debt stupid. Right? It's about the debt profile being held by people, not necessarily the debt of the nation, right, as a country, but the debt of the individuals within it, right? That is what is, I think, an important thing. And this basically charts all of that debt with the potential gross domestic product. And when you look at it, they plot it from 1970 to 2017, and it is 40 times greater than the GDP. When you see where the GDP is in relation to it, it's creepy. Even if you just go, and it really kind of diverged or dramatically from each other right around 1985, 1990, but then really turned into a rocket ship right around 2000. And when you look at this and you realize, wow, and think about to yourself, how difficult was the last downturn, right? It was painful for a lot of people, right? It supposedly was this global downturn that was horrible. Well, look at what it is on that chart. It is nothing. It is the meagerest of flattenings with a little bit of a downturn on the end that then just ramps right up to 2017. They go on to state in this article, and some of this just, when you read the words and you let what they mean actually sink in, it really scares the crap out of you. To support the current level of asset prices, we have been growing our debts more than twice as fast as our national income, GDP. Any household knows that you can't do this for long before insolvency occurs. Nations, even those with a printing press, can't escape this same fate in the long run. Now, take a look at the chart that's now currently on Pinterest. I'll also post it to the show notes at therebelbroker.com. And they refer to that little wiggle in the debt line from 2008 to 2009. Now, that's almost destroyed the world during the great financial crisis. Look at those asset price charts. Now look at it and see how much higher we are today than we were back in 2008. And then they say, so are you one of those people wondering how much more painful the next downturn will be when we fall from even loftier heights this time? Are you one of those few folks who haven't already forgotten that the S&P declined over 50% in the short term between the end of 2007 and the beginning of 2009? If you are, and you've decided not to participate in today's Ponzi scheme markets and instead build cash, it's been a painful ride watching the prices of nearly every other asset vault higher year over year while your cash pile simply sits there. And if the feeling of missing the rally isn't bad enough, with the mainstream media and your brother-in-law constantly rubbing your nose in it, there's a host of new threats besieging these cash these days. And then they go on and discuss those, right? And I'm not sure I'm going to get so much into those, but what I'd like to talk about is some of the we may actually make a whole other show out of these other issues that are in this article. Absolutely. I'm going to make it the first article that's linked in the show notes. Make sure to check it out. I think it's really a good overview. But what do you do? What is the defense mechanism? Now, he earlier on thought things would happen at a more accelerated rate. So he clearly thought 5 years ago he was probably a year, 2 years, 3 years tops away from bad things. And for those of you who've been listening to the show for a week or more, you know, or even just a week, I think we talked about this last week, my feeling is we are a year to 2.5 years away from bad stuff. And I think we're at a point where the level of growth we'll see from here on till we hit the peak is limited. I don't think we're going to see, 20%. I don't think we're going to see double-digit growth between now and the next downturn. So where does it go? Like I've mentioned before, money just sitting somewhere is poorly used money. Money in and of itself has very fleeting value. And by fleeting, I really just mean it's one of those things that's going to change from day to day. As the example I used before was, if you've got cash in your hands and you simply hold on to it, if I have $1 in my hand and today I can buy a loaf of bread with that, with inflation, a year from now, I won't be able to buy that loaf of bread with that dollar. So don't think of it as a dollar. Think of it as a loaf of bread. And a year from now, I could get less of it with this thing in my hand. So how do you defend yourself against that? And what I would do is say, stick with things that will always be needed, right? The indispensable product. People can live without an iPhone. People can live without a Mercedes. And some people can live without a car. There's an awful lot of things that you can trim. I mean, if things are really bad for you, if we see a dump like what these guys are talking about, and people are making tough choices about where their assets are going to go, where their money is going to go, and keep in mind that if these bad things happen that they're talking about, right along with them is going to be all these other things we've talked about, whether we're talking about student loan defaults and whether or not the federal government's going to bail some of these out, or student loans that get forgiven, as we talked about yesterday, that somebody somewhere is going to have to pay that, and that's probably going to end up being printed money from the federal government. If we want to talk about pensions, all of these various things, almost all the solutions seem to point to the federal government printing money. And higher velocity money, because it's money that will end up in the hands of people like you and me. That means those dollars you have drop in value. So you're not defending your money by holding on to it. Every dollar you don't spend right now is money. Every day you wait, your money is worth less than it was yesterday, right? And on some level, whether it's 0.0 something cents, maybe it's not some huge noticeable everyday number, but every day you're holding on to it and it's not working for you, you're losing money. Just by inflation, just by the inertia of regular old inflation, whether you believe the lower numbers that get reported or you subscribe to the way inflation used to be calculated where it included gas and food, you're talking 5%, 4% inflation. So if you're not doing something with your money that makes at least that amount of return on the base investment, you're not breaking even, right? So what do? Well, you do what I've suggested before. You don't get drawn into these markets that are ridiculously overvalued. Assets, even in the world of real estate, it's not a universal thing. Not every market has ridiculously overpriced assets. There are some markets where you can go in there, get your hands on an asset, and it is going to continue to perform even in a downturn. And the other thing is, it's kind of a relative thing, right? In terms of once you've traded your money for another thing, depending on what's going on with the marketplaces, you're either protecting that money from now losing value because it's no longer money, it's tied with some other asset, or you're leaving it to the vagaries of whatever decisions get made by financial institutions and other people. So it's also a way for you to take more control over what happens with your money. So you can own the process of whether or not it's earning for you. So what would my suggestion be? Now, of course, I'm a real estate guy. Real estate's in the name of the show. So clearly, I am going to be of the opinion that the real estate is the solution. And that's where I find my solution. Should you simply buy into this because I say so? No. I've always encouraged all of you to think for yourselves. That's why I include the links to the stuff I talk about, to the articles that got me thinking about one thing or another, because I want you to come to your own conclusions. And my bias isn't of the I want you to do something in real estate so it makes me money flavor. Do I want to make money? Absolutely. I would love for this show to make me money, and I want it to eventually make me money. But I want it to make me money because it deserves to make money. I want it to make money because I'm providing a thing. I'm giving you something that's valued, and you appreciate it, and then I make money because you have paid me with your time. You've given me the gift of your time to listen to what I have to say on this stuff. And some other joker out there who wants to sell something I don't think is a ripoff would like access to people like you. So eventually, someday, that's how this thing will pay for itself. Man, I can feel myself going into the weeds. But my bias is one of familiarity. My go-to solution is real estate because I know it. You know, it's because I'm familiar with it. I've seen how it works. I'm familiar with its past statistically. I wouldn't touch the stock market. I think the stock market's goofy. But to be really honest with you, I can't tell you if that's because I'm not knowledgeable enough or if I'm right. I feel like I know enough to know it's not the thing for me. I feel like it would take an awful lot more effort to be able to figure out what's going on with the stock market than with the real estate. It seems to me like there is so much bizarre junk involved in the stock market, and so much behind the scenes manipulation that it would be really difficult to be a master of that. Whereas, at least in the real estate world, it's a little bit more of a real market. Now, we've talked about how it's not a real market in terms of how lending's being manipulated and all these other kinds of things. But I think it's less so than those kinds of things. And at the end of the day, I want something real. I don't get anything real with the stock market. I get just a piece of paper that says I own an interest in a company. I get a deed to a house, and I own a thing that somebody needs to keep water off of their head and to keep their children warm and dry, and to have their meals every night and to come home to after a hard day at work, right? So maybe real estate's just for the more physical minded, who doesn't want to deal with the esoterics of this piece of paper that says I theoretically own some gold or some other resource or own interest in a company. No thanks. Because you know what? Whether or not that company succeeds is totally out of my control. Whether or not my rental property succeeds and whether or not I continue to hold on to that thing is totally up to me. That's why I like real estate. So what do I look for? I would park my money in something, in a marketplace where it has proven itself resilient against past downturns like this. So you don't want volatility. If you go with volatility, we're at an upward, and if you're at an upward swing in that particular marketplace, well, the next time bad volatility comes, you're going to get beaten to death with the devaluation of your property. Now, and remember also, I've said this before, if I go and I buy a home for $100,000 and I now rent it out, I'm making positive cash flow. Let's say I've paid cash for it. And let's say the value of that property drops to $60,000. I am not $40,000 poorer. I'm only $40,000 poorer if I sell it. But if I've bought the property outright and I'm renting it, I've achieved a couple of things. One, okay, now I have my money that will get affected by inflation into a real property that could also be affected negatively by market changes in terms of increases or decreases. But at the same time that money's tied up, it's making me money. It is making me cash flow every month. And if I've purchased it at either 100% down or, and purchased it outright with cash, or maybe I only put down 50% or 60%, whatever money I do have tied up in it is making me some amount of monthly cash flow. And with a larger down payment, it also gives me the flexibility to live through a downturn. Let's pretend, because remember, we already talked about the rental market in a lot of areas sounding like it's at a peak where there's a huge number of people renting, the biggest number since over 50 years, and a whole bunch of those folks, 70% plus, don't want to rent. Now, let's say that the market changes in such a way that becomes a reality, that becomes a real possibility for a huge number of people to shift from being renters to being buyers. Well, that spells a huge dump in rental rates, right? Be ready for that. And by having more properties that you own, either outright or where you have a huge margin in terms of positive cash flow, you're kind of secure there. You could cut your rent by a good chunk and still make positive cash flow. And that would just be a survival technique, because you know what's going to happen? Eventually, and it may take a little while, just like last time, things will recover, hopefully in a more sane way, but things will recover and you'll be able to charge more and more for rent. Property values will come up. But all through this entire process, you are still making money on your investment. It may not be as much as you want. It may not be as much as you when you started out, but you've weathered the storm. So, and maybe I'm too much of an old fogey. Maybe I'm too conservative, but that feels like a good thing to me. I like the idea of having an investment that can be out there doing stuff for me that is set up in such a way that I can survive it. So what does that mean equal to me? Some general rules: less leverage. And I know everyone loves leverage, but I think in a market like we've got now, less leverage is better. I'd rather have less leverage with a much lower probability of facing foreclosure or financial ruin than having more leverage and having a thinner margin that I can't part with. And if the market influences force me to part with that so that I'm negative cash flow, that's going to suck. So instead of having, say, $300,000 in my pocket and buying 4 properties with 20% down, maybe I'm only going to buy 2 properties where I put 50% down or 60% down. I don't want as much leverage. So let's take it to the real world here for a sec. As most of you probably know, anyone who's, God, I say this way too much. For those who've been listening for a while, you know I'm in the process of trying to get my home sold. It's not on the market yet. Long story, tons of delays, family is involved. You know how it goes. Once that happens, I'm not buying a house for me to live in. Will I be buying a house? Yes, I will. But I won't be living in it. I will be renting a house that I live in. I will be taking the money that I make from this property and I will be going to markets I like. Right now, Tennessee feels very sexy to me. There's also another community I might consider in Phoenix, or north of Phoenix in Prescott, Arizona, which I may or may not do. I don't have any sexy numbers, none at all. I just kind of like Arizona. But wonderful things I'm hearing about places like in Tennessee. So I would love to go out there and buy properties in several different markets. I don't want to go to Memphis and buy all Memphis properties. I don't want to go to Chattanooga and buy all Chattanooga properties. I would love to buy, say, 3 or 4 properties minimum that are scattered out in different markets that rely on different economic underpinnings for success in those communities. So that if one suffers, the odds of my other suffering aren't as high, right? I guess you could call it real estate diversification. That's my plan. And my feeling is, given how much, and my cash flow will be freaking amazing. Even if I didn't buy these other investment properties, if I sell my home now and rent a home, my cash flow is actually going to be better. So just heaping on the investment angle to it, my cash flow is going to be awesome. And when I do the math, it makes me realize that if I do this about every year and a half to 2 years, I would be able to buy another investment property with a substantial down, like way more than 20%, every year and a half to 2 years. Easily. Maybe even every year. That's a conservative estimate on my end. So that'd be fantastic. And that would lead me into a market. And I would probably start to try to accumulate some cash to make some bigger purchases in markets when things really go down. So it could be a very amazing opportunity if I end up being right and this downturn occurs, this asset devaluation occurs, I honestly think it's going to happen. I would be in a position to really take advantage of it. I'd have some secure investments in relatively conservative areas that have historically not suffered a lot when downturns occurred, and I would be in a position to then move on more properties in areas that right now are totally overpriced. And once they have kind of hit rock bottom and bad things have happened there and the properties are again on the marketplace at great values, I could then sweep in and buy several of those. So that's kind of that's the long term. If we're talking years down the road, this would probably be kind of in full gear. If I'm right, it would be in full gear by, say, 2022 or 2023. So that's kind of it. And that's the thought process. This is how I spent my Sunday reading this article and really thinking through what all this means. What does it equal? And if you're trying to take away from it, what do I do next type stuff, I think this is it. Now, of course, let's look at the flip side of that coin. I already mentioned that the reason why my go-to is real estate is because I know it. I feel like I can make good decisions, or at least decisions that get me pretty dang close to what my goal is. Maybe something completely different for you, right? It could be you're a car person, so you know cars, and maybe you know how to buy and sell cars in a way that make you tons of money. I still would argue that real estate's a better way to go. When I compare asset classes, real estate is again, it fits into that very short list. People will always need a place to live. So that's kind of my thing. That's where I'm leaning. That's where I'm going to go. And I'm also going to diversify in terms of the type of properties I'm going to go. I might have a single family residential here and there, but I'm also going to do multis. I'm going to do duplex. I'm going to do quads, and more if possible. Just because once you do the math, you discover that it's a quantum leap. Once you go from just single family residential rentals, they can be less of a headache. But once you go from singles to multis, each additional unit is like a force multiplier, it seems, when you do the math and figure out what your cash flow would be. So anyway. All right, folks, it's been a really long show today. I hope we've covered some really good data for you. We've had some great stuff before the break that really just ran down some interesting hot off the presses style numbers. And we've done sort of a review of what's going on from Peak Prosperity's perception on what this bubble is, where we sit in terms of asset valuation versus debt and all these other crazy things. It's nuts. I hope this has been valuable for you. The goal, of course, always is to leave you with way more value in terms of knowledge bouncing around in your head than the time that you've invested in listening to the show. And of course, I hope I've achieved that today. Thanks again for listening, everybody. And I'll talk to y'all next time.